This is the full story of Harold Henthorn, a man who appeared to be the perfect husband until 2 wives died under eerily similar circumstances. In this video, I've put together all 4 parts of the Harold Henthorn case so you can see the full picture, the lies, the manipulation, and the shocking unraveling of a narcissistic killer. Let's get into it. This case begins in the Rocky Mountain National Park in September of 2012. Once a year, Harold Henthorn planned a special trip to celebrate his wedding anniversary with his wife Toni Henthorn. That year, Harold made a 911 call.
911, what's the address, the emergency?
Hello, my name is Harold Henthorn. I'm in the Rocky Mountain National Park.
Okay.
I need an Alpine Mountain Rescue Team immediately.
Okay, what is your exact location?
My exact location is Deer Mountain, North Summit. About 1 mile south of the visitor center.
Okay, I'm going to transfer you to the park, so hang on the line. You're going to hear some clicking, and right now I'm pulling up your lat and your long on my phone here. Let me try it one more time before I transfer you. They don't have this technology.
Can I make sure you know where I am first?
Okay. Yep, I have one moment.
Okay.
Hang on.
Let me tell you right where I am.
And I'll introduce who we are when they pick up the phone.
This is Esther, and we have a gentleman on Deer Mountain. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you. My wife has fallen from a rock on the north summit of Deer Mountain, on the Deer Mountain Trail, and she's in really critical condition. She's had a bad fall. Her heartbeat is out 30, 40 feet, 30 feet.
30, 40 feet.
I think 30 feet.
30 feet. Are you with
I
her
can't
now?
be sure. I am. Let me be sure that you know my location first. With a have really bad cell coverage.
Okay.
Okay, I'm on Deer Mountain,
Okay.
near the summit, not the normal, regular northern summit, on the southern outcrops.
And tell me some things about the patient.
She is a white female, 50 years old, great health. She has respiration approximately 5 to 8 beats a minute. Her pulse is about between 60 and 80 beats a minute.
Okay, what's her main injury?
Head injury,
Head injury.
concussion.
Okay, any other injuries?
To be internal,
Is she conscious and breathing?
no, she's not. She has not been conscious. She is breathing. Anywhere between 5 and 8 beats a minute now.
Okay, hold on just a second.
Okay. Here's the thing. I will pay any and all expenses for a helicopter. I don't care if it's private. I don't care if it's commercial. It wouldn't matter if it's medevac. I'll pay any and all expenses right now.
Okay.
Have you drop a paramedic down here?
I understand that, sir. It's really on the safety of everybody involved, so that would really be up to the ranger
Okay.
charge.
Weather's good. There's no wind whatsoever right now. Weather is excellent. This building is at least 5 to 8 miles. There's definitely. I'm not a paramedic, but I'm doing all I can do. You could safely drop a paramedic from a 10-foot rope. I mean, easily do that.
I understand that, sir, but they definitely need to probably get someone on scene. They do have hasty teams, and those are the teams that are going to run up there as fast as possible and get to your location. They're asking you to put as many bright items out as possible to see if they can't see you, if they can blast you.
Okay. Let me see if I can hear something.
Okay, are you back with your wife now?
I'm right here. Yeah, I'm right with her.
Okay, how is she doing?
Her respiration's weaker.
Her respiration is weaker.
Yeah, 5 beats a minute.
5 beats a minute?
Yeah.
Okay, do you know how to perform CPR?
I do.
Okay, and more about this fall, sir. Was it like a sliding fall, or did she fall, directly?
I didn't see it exactly. I was messing with one camera. She was messing with the other one.
So you didn't see her fall?
I didn't actually see. I mean, I saw the motion, but
Okay, so I'm going to hang up with you. If you want to leave your phone on, if that makes you feel better, definitely do that. You can call us if anything changes with her.
I'll call you exactly 6:30.
At exactly 6:30?
I'll call you exactly 6:30.
Okay, and like I said, you can always call 911 and they'll transfer it over.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
The park ranger immediately sprung into action, heading towards Deer Mountain, deep in the park where Toni had reportedly fallen. But the location Harold gave was extremely remote, There was no place to land a helicopter, so the rescue team had to go in on foot. The Rangers arrived at 6:15 p.m. It was already getting dark, and the light was fading fast, and the terrain was rough. Just before 7 p.m., a call came over the radio. CPR was in progress. Harold was attempting to revive Toni. The Ranger pushed forward, using a flashlight in the moonlight to guide his way. He was able to blow his whistle, and he heard a return whistle from Harold. Moments later, the Ranger found him. Harold led him to Toni's body. Her head was wrapped in cloth. Her eyes were half open. The Ranger kneeled down and took over CPR. But it was too late. He would say, "I'm sorry, she's gone." Harold nodded solemnly. He agreed she was gone. The Ranger hiked back down with Harold, while others remained behind with Toni's body, spending the night on the mountain until daylight. When the sun rose, the investigation began. At first, no crime was suspected. Taking photos of the body, the cliffside, and the surrounding area, he carefully took notes. Every detail mattered. That was when he spotted something strange. A nearby tree with several branches snapped off. He began referring to it as the impact tree. Then he noticed more inconsistencies. Toni's boot had come off. But boots don't just untie themselves during a fall. Her camera and backpack were laying right next to her body, completely intact. In a fall like that, that's not what you would expect. Still, everything was collected and passed to the Ranger who first found Harold on the mountain, Ranger Chris Faraday. Faraday continued the investigation by checking out Harold's Jeep, parked nearby. Inside he found a map of the park, with a large X marking the exact spot where Toni had fallen. At that point, it stopped looking like a tragic accident. This started looking like a murder. Because this was a potential homicide inside of a national park, the case was handed over to the Investigating Service Branch, or ISB. They handled felonies on federal park land. The lead investigator assigned to this case was Beth Schott. Ranger Faraday had made an arrangement to visit Harold's home in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, just 2 days after Toni's death, on October 1st, 2012. He arrived at the Henthorn residence. He greeted him at the door, holding the hand of his daughter Haley. Faraday followed Harold down the basement, where Harold's home office was set up. Faraday had brought something with him, the memory card of Toni's camera. They sat down together and started going through the pictures. Harold looked visibly upset. "That's my wife, Mark," Harold would softly say. "That's my wife." Harold told the investigator that Toni had begun walking towards the cliff's edge, and that he didn't see her actually fall. "Why?" the investigator would ask. Because according to him, he was distracted, reading a text message saying that his daughter, Haley, had just won her soccer game. But Ranger Faraday noticed something odd. That text, it came in at 5:54 p.m., the exact same time that Harold had called 911. Even more confusing, Harold had previously told Faraday that it had taken 45 minutes to climb down to where her body landed, and then he made the call. So which is it? The timeline wasn't adding up. Then Faraday showed Harold the map that he found in his Jeep, the one with the X marking the exact spot Toni had fallen. And for one of the only times during the interview, Harold had nothing to say. No deflection, no story, just silence. After that moment, Harold stopped responding to Faraday's calls altogether. So with communication shut down, investigators turned their attention to what they still have, Toni's camera. Though the device itself was broken, the SD card was still intact, and on it were the last photos ever taken of Toni. Meanwhile, lead investigator Beth Schott was speaking regularly with Toni's family back in Jackson, Mississippi, the Baudelaires. They helped fill in the picture of who Toni really was, and how they found out that she died. Her brother Todd Baudelaire remembered that night vividly. "I just sat down around 7 p.m. I looked over to see my phone ringing," Todd recalled. "It was my brother, Barry," he said. "Toni's been in an accident. They're trying to rescue her, but from what I'm hearing, I don't think she's going to make it." Todd hung up and sat in silence. His wife could tell something was wrong. She asked, "Is everything okay?" Todd looked at her and said, Barry wants us to tell Mom and Dad something happened to Toni. Toni Henthorn was born into a family that had done well for themselves. Her father worked in the oil and gas industry and had discoveries that left the family financially stable. Toni was driven. She was excellent at whatever she set her mind to, whether it was music, sports, or academics. But from a young age, Toni knew what she wanted. She wanted to become a doctor. She pursued a career in ophthalmology, a field that would allow her to help people while also giving her time to raise a family. Toni's first marriage was to someone she met in medical school, but it didn't work out. And when the marriage ended, Toni blamed herself. To cope, she threw herself into work, opening her own practice in Jackson and Vicksburg, Mississippi. Both became highly successful. She also became very active in her church, singing in the choir and volunteering. But her friends and family could tell Toni still longed to start a family. She wanted to love and to be loved. One day out of the blue, Toni told her friend, "I met someone online." Toni had joined a Christian dating site, and there she met Harold Henthorn. He said all the right things. When Harold finally met Toni's friends, he made a giant impression. He was charming, polite, and seemed devoted. But none of them could ever imagine what would come next. At this point in his life, Harold Henthorn was presenting himself as an independent fundraiser, working with churches and hospitals as a fundraiser. That's what he said anyway. He claimed he made good money doing it, always implied that he was successful, wealthy even. But when some of Toni's family met him, their impression wasn't entirely glowing. Harold came off loud, self-important, the kind of guy who would dominate the room, almost like a used car salesman. Still, not long after they began dating, Harold and Toni announced that they were getting married. Everyone was happy for her. But here's the thing. By the time they tied the knot, Toni had only seen Harold 6 to 7 times in person. Despite that, they had a big church wedding, and for a while looked like a picture-perfect love story. They lived in Mississippi for 2 years. Then Harold wanted to move back to Colorado, so Toni sold both of her medical practices. They relocated to an upscale suburb called Highland Ranch. It was around this time that Toni became pregnant. She was in her mid-40s, and after everything she's been through, this seemed like her dream finally came true. From the outside, things looked good. Toni became a partner in a well-regarded eye care center in Denver. After her death, investigator Beth Schott and Ranger Faraday interviewed her co-workers. They were looking to compare stories, especially with what Harold already told them. Harold claimed that the trip to the Rocky Mountain National Park was a surprise for their 12th anniversary. But when Beth and Faraday talked to the staff at the clinic, a different story emerged. Toni's co-workers said they helped him plan the surprise, but Toni didn't exactly look thrilled when it happened. They made a fake schedule for her. Harold came in dressed up like a patient, and one of the staff filmed the moment on their phone. Toni looked confused, not excited. Harold had a small to-go bag and arranged for a nanny to watch Haley. They jumped in the car and headed up to Estes Park. Along the way, they took photos, on their phones and with Toni's camera. The last photo was taken just before Toni's death. It wasn't of her. It was of Harold standing at the exact spot where she would later fall. The photo was taken just 15 minutes before she died. According to Harold, it was supposed to be a romantic weekend. They stayed at the Stanley Hotel. The next day, he says they packed a couple of sandwiches and headed out for the hike at Deer Mountain Trailhead. But something about this timing stood out. Harold told Faraday that they didn't start the hike until 2 p.m. in September. The sun sets around 6 p.m., leaving a pretty narrow window for a full hike. Using the timestamp from the photos, the investigating team was able to recreate their path step by step. Harold said they stepped off the trail to find somewhere private, but anyone familiar with these woods know you could step 20 feet into any direction and be alone. You don't need to go far. The spot they chose for lunch, it couldn't even be seen from the trail. It looked like the kind of place someone would have to scout out ahead of time. When Faraday asked why they kept hiking beyond the hidden lunch spot, Harold gave a strange answer. He said Toni saw some turkeys and wanted to follow them, which was weird. Turkeys aren't even common in that part of the park. Then Harold changed the story. said they were just looking for a romantic spot. But there's more. Toni had recently had knee surgery. She was not in the kind of shape to be climbing a 60 degrees rock face, especially knowing she would have to climb back up. Beth Schott would later say there was no reason for them to be there unless Harold wanted to push Toni. And when the investigators looked back at those photos Harold had Toni take, photos of him standing right at the edge where she fell, they realized something chilling. It looked like Harold was using the photo op to lure her into position. The spot where Toni's body was found was roughly 160 feet below the very tree Harold was photographed leaning on. Just below it was what the investigators called the impact tree. There was blood and hair stuck in the bark. At the base of the tree was a pool of blood, and about 8 feet away from that, drag marks. So not only had Toni fallen, Harold had moved her. Beth Schott would meet with the local coroner, Dr. James Wilkerson. His findings: multiple blunt force trauma. Toni didn't just fall, she tumbled down the steep, unforgiving rock face. She had abrasions on her forehead and a deep laceration on her scalp down to the skull. And yet during the 9/11 call, Harold never once mentioned the blood. He told the dispatcher that Toni had a concussion. He also said he was doing CPR. But here's the strange part. When the ranger got there, Toni's lipstick was still perfectly intact. Not smudged, not wiped. It was perfect. If Harold really had been doing CPR, that wouldn't make any sense. Faraday knew something was off. He came into Beth's office and laid it all out. They needed Harold's phone records. The reasoning for this: the text Harold claimed that he got from the nanny, the one saying that Haley won her soccer game, came in at 5:55 p.m., but Harold made the 911 call at 5:55 p.m. He told Faraday he climbed down to Toni's body first, a journey he said took about 45 minutes, and then called 911. The timeline didn't add up. Faraday had asked Harold to show him all the messages he received that day. Harold refused. When they finally got the records, everything began to unravel. Harold called 911 at 5:55 p.m., saying things like, "My wife is dying." Then he hung up. At 6:16 p.m., he called Barry Beaudelet, Toni's brother, saying she had fallen. Then began a rapid series of text messages to Barry. 6:16, Barry, urgent, Toni is injured, in Estes Park, fell from rock. 6:16 p.m. again, critical, requested flight for life. And 6:17 p.m., EMT ranger on way. At no point did he mention a massive head wound. At no point did he say Toni was bleeding out. Just vague, urgent messages. Harold said that he had began CPR the whole time, but he was also texting, making calls, even building a fire. And again, Toni's lipstick, still perfect. By the end of the night, Harold sent and received 98 text messages. Toni's family was watching it all unfold, and something didn't feel right. Harold's behavior wasn't that of a grieving husband. Just 36 hours after her death, Harold had already arranged a memorial video package. He asked a family friend to officiate the service, and when Toni's family flew into Colorado, Harold told them she wanted to be cremated. This was the first time they ever heard of that. They objected, but Harold insisted. He would say, "Come on, you know she wanted to be cremated." At the funeral, he seated Toni's family at the back row. He made a dramatic entrance, the last person to be ushered in. Even the photographer he hired, contacted the day after Toni died, had already been given a batch of 70 hand-picked photos, and every single one of them featured Harold, like Toni's life didn't start until she met him. People at the funeral noticed it too. Harold wasn't crying, he wasn't mourning, he wasn't angry. He seemed irritated that there was an investigation at all. At one point he even said to someone, Toni had to go and get herself killed on federal land. But what truly shocked the investigators was what came next. A letter would arrive at the ranger's office. It was about Harold's first wife. Her death had also been considered an accident, until now. Harold Henthorn had a story. He said he was planning something special, a surprise for his wife Toni, to celebrate their 12-year anniversary. His idea of romance? A strenuous hike up Deer Mountain in Colorado's Anestis Park. But here's the thing, Deer Mountain is no romantic getaway. It's a tough, rocky climb, the kind most middle-aged couples would not consider as the ideal way to mark more than a decade of marriage. Shortly after Toni's fatal fall from the mountain, Harold sat down for an interview with the police, promptly lawyered up. From that point, no more questions without his lawyer present. Red flag number 1. Detectives, now suspicious, turned to those who knew Harold best: friends, family, most notable Toni's parents, the Baudelaires, who have always been uneasy about Harold. They kept in touch with him only for the sake of the couple's young daughter, Haley. They were feeding info straight to the lead investigator behind the scenes. Then came the nanny. They told detectives something chilling. Toni and Harold no longer shared a bed. Even stranger, Harold would vanish for hours, sometimes days, taking random trips with no luggage at all. The nanny suspected an affair, but that would turn out to be just the tip of the iceberg. Harold also worked from home, claiming to run a national business out of the basement. He bragged about managing 10 to 12 regional supervisors and overseeing 90 employees across the country. He painted himself as a self-made, wealthy entrepreneur. But in reality, Harold and Toni were strapped for cash, frequently borrowing money from Toni's parents. Investigators dug into the so-called business and found nothing: no listings, no registration, no staff. Even the business cards handed out with the title like certified fundraiser were fake. He wasn't registered anywhere. It was all smoke and mirrors. Then the bombshell. A letter landed on the detective's desk. It was about Harold's first wife, Lynn Henthorn. According to Harold, Lynn's death in 1995 was due to a car accident, a tragic mishap, but depending on who you talked to, the story changed. Some people heard she died of cancer, others in a car accident. It was suspiciously inconsistent. After Toni's death hit the news, 17 anonymous tips flooded in to the police, the FBI, and the coroner. Every tip said the same thing: look into the first wife. When investigators reviewed Lynn's case, they found her death certificate listed the cause of undetermined, with a chilling note: homicide could not be ruled out. The noose was tightening. 2 wives, 2 mysterious deaths, and 1 man in the center of it all. Centennial, Colorado, a quiet suburb town where Harold Henthorn and his first wife Lynn built a life together. Or so it seemed. After Lynn's sudden and tragic death in 1995, Harold stayed in the family home. He lived there for years until he met Toni. Here's where things get chilling. Harold was married to Lynn 11 years, and Toni 12 years, just long enough for life to be built and then ended. Are you sensing a pattern? Family and friends who knew Lynn remembered her as deeply kind, compassionate, religious, someone who gave without asking for anything back. But when it came to Harold, the most common word used to describe him was controlling. Lynn met Harold at a wedding. She was excited, told her friends, "I can't wait for you to meet him. He seems so honest, so caring." And at first everyone thought so too. One of Lynn's brothers described Harold as an extrovert, a salesman type of guy, charismatic, confident, and convincing. But things changed fast. When it came time to plan the wedding, Harold took full control. He organized binders for each caterer, vendor, photographer. Every detail passed through him, and once the wedding was over, he whisked Lynn away from her family in Pennsylvania, relocating her to Colorado, far from everyone she knew. Over time, when her family visited, they noticed something. Lynn was changing. She was quieter, more withdrawn. Meanwhile, Harold was louder and more animated, almost like he was putting on a performance. Lynn's sister called her to chat, asking if it was a good time. Lynn's response was unsettling. "Now's not a good time. Can you call back when Harold is home?" We decided we only talked to family when we were both on the line.
Co-workers noticed something too. Harold consistently complained about extreme back pain, making Lynn take on all responsibilities at home while still working. And Lynn, despite battling rheumatoid arthritis, she even monitored her medication carefully to avoid anything that might affect her ability to become pregnant. But underneath the surface, she was suffering. She confided in a close friend, saying, "I don't know what to do. We're having problems, but Harold says therapy or talking to any others is being disloyal." Then came the shock. Lynn died unexpectedly. Her death was ruled an accident, but her family always had a sinking feeling that something wasn't right, that Harold was involved. Years later, Toni plunged to her death under suspicious circumstances. That gut feeling came back with a vengeance. 2 wives, 2 suspicious deaths, and the same man right in the middle. Some cases take years to build, others ignite like a wildfire. Toni's suspicious death making headlines, and a flood of anonymous tips pointing investigators back to Harold Henthorn's first wife, Lynn. Momentum was building fast. What had been a closed chapter was about to crack wide open. Then a quiet Sunday afternoon in Douglas County, Colorado, something unexpected happened. Laura Thomas, the county coroner, heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find a familiar face. A man from her church, someone local. He asked her if she attended Cherry Hill Community Church and if she worked as a coroner. Then came the questions that changed everything. Did you know Harold Henthorn went to our church and that people are starting to talk about his first wife? Laura remembered the case. Lynn Henthorn died years ago. Case closed. But something about the man's tone concerned her. Wouldn't leave her alone. The very next day she went to the sheriff's office and asked to see the file. "That's closed," the sheriff said. He printed out the report and handed it to her. Laura took it home and opened it up in her office. As she read, she started underlining paragraph after paragraph. So many things weren't adding up. By the time she finished, she came to the same conclusion as her neighbor. Something is very, very wrong. According to the police report, Harold and Lynn had been driving through the mountains. Harold claimed the front right tire felt spongy, so he pulled over to check it. He said the jack wasn't working, but conveniently he happened to have 2 boat jacks in his car. 2 jacks, one a scissor jack, manual, slow and safe, the other a bottle jack, hydraulic, fast, and potentially dangerous. This is where Harold's story gets questionable. He told the police he was removing the lug nuts, handing them to Lynn. Then he walked to the back of the Jeep, tossed the tire in, and then he heard it, a scream. He rushed back and claimed to find Lynn beneath the brake rotor, crushed. But how did she end up there? Harold's explanation. He said Lynn must have dropped the lug nuts and for some reason decided to crawl underneath the Jeep, belly first at night in the gravel, to recover them. Think about it. It's pitch black. They're on the side of a mountain road. Harold wants us to believe a woman with rheumatoid arthritis crawled underneath a raised vehicle in loose gravel to grab lug nuts. Let's be real. No woman is doing that. Not your wife, not mine, no one. And yet, that was the story. Somehow the story was enough to close the case, until now. With Toni's suspicious fall in the Rocky Mountain National Park, the cracks in Harold's past began to shudder. What once looked like a tragic accident now felt like something far more sinister. 2 wives, 2 eerily similar deaths, and one man tying them together. By now, the detectives investigating Toni Henthorn's fall in the Rocky Mountain National Park knew one thing for sure. If they wanted to understand what really happened to Toni, they needed to go back 18 years to the death of Lynn Henthorn. There's just one problem. They couldn't prosecute Harold for Lynn's death. It wasn't their jurisdiction. But they could connect the dots. Lead Detective Beth Schott reached out to Douglas County Sheriff's Office and asked them to reopen Lynn's case. It had nearly been 2 decades. Still, Detective David Weaver took it on in January of 2013. His first step was to re-interview every possible witness. Witness number 1, Dwight DeVries. Dwight recalled seeing Harold standing outside the Jeep around 9:30 p.m. Lynn was still inside, her face pale, her expression terrified. Harold approached Dwight's car quickly and clearly wanted him gone. Dwight offered to help change the tire. No thanks. He offered to pull his car up to shine his headlights on the roadside. We're fine. Dwight knew something wasn't right. He drove off, but never forgot the look on Lynn's face. Witness number 2, Patricia Montoya. Detective Weaver called her next. Before he could say much, Patricia interrupted. Is this about the dead woman on the mountain? She asked. I still have nightmares about that night. It was around 10 p.m. when Patricia came around the bend of the road. She spotted a man waving a flare, signaling for help. It was Harold. He said he had a flat tire and a terrible accident happened. Patricia and her friend got out of their car and instantly saw it. 2 legs protruding from underneath the Jeep. It was Lynn. They rushed to pull her out. They began CPR immediately, but then Harold began screaming at them, "Leave her alone." He was frantic, not concerned, not grateful, agitated, defensive and angry. As they tried to help Lynn, Patricia took off her coat and laid it over her. Lynn's body was starting to turn blue, and just as the emergency sirens echoed up the mountain, Patricia saw Harold's face shift, not to relief, but to panic. Detective Weaver now had more questions than he did answers. Could a Jeep realistically fall off the jack? Could Lynn actually fit underneath the brake rotor? And lastly, this wasn't a question, just the truth. Lug nuts don't roll. Not in gravel, not enough to make someone crawl underneath the car in the dark. Detective Beth Schott and David Weaver recreated the scene. They followed Harold's statement to the letter. He claimed he tossed the tire into the Jeep's trunk, and that made the car fall. They tried it. They threw the tire, kicked the bumper, pushed the frame. Nothing. The only time the car fell was when it was pushed from the side, hard, or when they quickly released the hydraulic jack. It wasn't adding up at all. And then came the detail that chilled them. Lynn had no dirt under her fingernails, no evidence of crawling, dragging, or even moving under the car. For Lynn to be underneath the Jeep that long, she had to be sedated, or worse. Finally, the insurance policy surfaced. Months before the accident, Harold took out a life insurance policy on Lynn. But that's not just any policy. One of a double payout in the event of a car accident. Coincidence? I don't think so. The answers were becoming more obvious every step. The evidence, the behavior, the story, all pointed to a pattern. 2 wives, both devoted, soft-spoken women, both dead under bizarre circumstances, and both just shy under 12 years. After 18 years, Lynn Henthorn's case was officially reopened, her death certificate reissued, changed to undetermined. But this time was a footnote. Homicide could not be ruled out. After Lynn's death, Harold didn't waste time grieving. He went looking for his next wife. He created a profile on a Christian dating site, painting himself as a successful, self-made man, a man of faith, but behind the polished bio and Sunday school smile was a very different man. Detective Weaver, digging deeper, began interviewing women Harold dated in between Lynn's mysterious death and his marriage to Toni. One of them was a family friend of Lynn's. They started seeing each other not long after Lynn's funeral. At first, Harold was charming, but the mask slipped fast. One night during a simple disagreement, he pinned her to the wall and held her until she admitted he was right. She was terrified. Another woman remembered something even more disturbing. They were on a date. Harold left his sunglasses at a restaurant. He called her the next day and asked her to pick them up, but the restaurant was closed, so she went to work instead. Harold lost it. He called her, screaming, belittling her, raging through the phone. But that wasn't the worst part. He showed up to her workplace, yelling at her in front of her coworkers until her boss had to escort him out. Even then, there was a mountain drive. A different woman recounted Harold taking her on a scenic route through the Rockies. At first, it seemed romantic, until he turned and said, "You know, I could kill you right here and leave you in these woods, and no one would find you until spring." She ended the relationship that night. Around 3 a.m., Harold began banging on her front door. She never answered, but she never forgot. Most of these women had one thing in common. Harold was always curious about their finances, what kind of family they came from, and whether or not they had money. Meanwhile, before meeting Toni, Harold stayed in touch with someone else, Grace Rischel, Lynn's brother's wife. They were close. Harold confided in her, leaned on her emotionally. Then one day he told her, "I've met someone." He was leaving for Mississippi for New Year's, and the someone was Toni. 9 months later they would be married. And just like Lynn, Toni was dead within 12 years. But Harold wasn't done. After Toni's death, with 2 wives gone, Harold turned his focus back to Grace. By now, Grace and her husband had separated, and Harold saw an opportunity. He began to slowly and methodically break her down, telling her all the ways her husband failed her, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. He tried to woo her, comfort her, possibly make her his next victim. 2 women dead, multiple women frightened, threatened, controlled, and still no formal conviction. Because while Harold tried to silence the truth, the evidence was screaming. The pattern was undeniable, the timeline unmistakable. And the next chapter, where Harold Henthorn would finally answer the questions everyone was asking. Was it bad luck or murder? And if it was murder, how many more were there supposed to be? Buckle up, because the truth lurking in Harold's past is more sinister than anyone ever imagined. Within weeks of Toni Henthorn's death, an anonymous letter arrived at the ranger station, but it wasn't about Toni, it was about Lynn. Park Ranger Beth Schott would quietly open an investigation. By then, it's been 18 long months since Toni's tragic fall, and nearly 19 years since Lynn Henthorn's mysterious death. As the investigation gained momentum, Harold Henthorn made his move early. He lawyered up almost immediately. Investigators knew they would never get a clean interview. Harold would never speak without an attorney present. That meant one thing. They would have to build their entire case on circumstantial evidence. No witnesses, no confession. Only Harold remained, the sole survivor of 2 tragedies. And so, they began the monumental task, starting at the beginning. The first step was simple but daunting. Build a timeline of Harold's life. Every coming and going, every unexplained trip. Investigators had to answer the impossible questions. Did Harold have a second life? It was a massive undertaking. Ranger Beth Schott pulled Harold's phone records, and immediately a single name surfaced: Grace Rischel. She was Harold's sister-in-law, married to Lynn Henthorn's brother. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Harold had always been a doting uncle to Grace's children. Nothing sinister stood out. But investigators couldn't ignore the possibility. Had Grace been just more than family? Was it an illicit relationship, part cause for Toni's death? The deeper they dug, the stranger things began to seem. Investigators paid a visit to Grace's home. Their questions were direct. Was she romantically involved with Harold? Grace didn't hesitate. She empathetically denied any romantic connection to Harold Henthorn. Instead, Grace opened up about a darker chapter of her life. In 2007, Grace and her husband, Kevin Rischel, had separated. She described that time as devastating. Her marriage crumbling, her finances in ruin, bankruptcy, foreclosure loomed. Her world was falling apart. But even in the midst of the chaos, Kevin Rischel recalled something chilling. Harold wasn't just offering help. He was inserting himself between Kevin and his children, quietly trying to turn their loyalty away from their father and towards him. After the split, Harold's intentions became clear, and even more disturbing, he told Grace that his line of work involved helping single women get back on their feet, claiming that both Lynn and later Toni had been part of his support mission, but it was all a lie. While whispering reassurances into Grace's ear, Harold urged her to take a massive step, to purchase a $400,000 life insurance policy, just in case something ever happened to her. He framed it as protection for her daughters. By 2010, Grace found an opportunity, a fresh start with a new job in Texas. But Harold's mask slipped again. When Grace told him she was leaving, Harold erupted. He demanded she move to Colorado instead. His old pattern of control and obsession came flooding back. Multiple calls, voicemails, and pressure.
Feeling suffocated, Grace made a decision that may have saved her life. She called the insurance broker and canceled her policy. Lead investigator Beth Schott delivered a devastating revelation to Grace, a truth she never saw coming. Harold never canceled her life insurance policy. In fact, it was worse than Grace could imagine. The policy named Harold Henthorn as sole beneficiary, not her daughters, not her family, just him. If anything were ever to happen to Grace, Harold would walk away with $400,000. There was no mention of her children, no preservation for their future. It was becoming painfully clear. Harold hadn't just been manipulating Grace's trust, he had set the stage for something far darker. Grace's blood ran cold as reality hit her. Was Harold planning to make her his third victim? The timeline was damning. The policy had been put in place just before Toni Henthorn's death. Chilling details suggest Harold had been methodically getting all his ducks in a row, laying the groundwork for the next move. Investigator Beth Schott later reflected on the mounting evidence with a heavy heart. The deeper they dug into Harold's life, the clearer it became. They weren't dealing with a grieving husband or a concerned uncle. They were staring into the mind of a man driven by pure, calculated evil. As investigators pushed deeper, a chilling pattern emerged. Insurance seemed to link everything. Every tragic death, every suspicious move. The investigating team soon discovered Harold had taken out far more life insurance on Lynn Henthorn than any of her family ever realized. Officially, Lynn and Harold even held policies of $300,000 for one another, but hidden beneath the surface was an additional policy Lynn had never known existed, some ranging up to $150,000. In the aftermath of Lynn's death, Harold quietly collected over $600,000, but the web didn't end there. Investigators turned their focus to Toni Henthorn and saw the same sinister blueprint unfold. Almost immediately after Harold began his relationship with Toni, he had started taking out life insurance policies, setting a deadly precedent. In the only interview Harold ever gave before securing a lawyer, he downplayed everything, telling investigators there was only one policy, but the truth told a different story. Beth Schott, refusing to stop digging, reached out to a publishing house for insurance policies, requesting any documentation tied to Toni Henthorn. What she uncovered was staggering. At least 4 separate life insurance companies held policies on Toni. Timeline was damning. In 2001, just a year after their marriage, Harold took out a $1.5 million policy. In 2005, the year their daughter Haley was born, another $1.5 million policy appeared. And by 2008, yet another policy had been added. The single policy Harold claimed it was a lie. The total value stacked up to a horrifying $4.7 million. Each policy was another thread in Harold's intricate web, and now investigators were starting to see the full, terrifying picture. A friend of Toni's would later say the saddest thing about the entire story was simple. We know Harold never loved her. Toni's mother remembered a slow, painful disconnection after her daughter moved to Colorado. Whenever she would try to call Toni, it wasn't Toni who answered, it was Harold every time. Harold was always there, listening, monitoring the conversation, ensuring nothing was said that he didn't approve. It was disturbingly similar to the pattern investigators uncovered with Lynn Henthorn years before, in Colorado. In Colorado, Harold's control tightened like a noose. Toni's own mother would go nearly a decade without having a simple private conversation with her own daughter. Once Harold had Toni fully in his grasp, he made her quit teaching Sunday school, he forced her to leave the church choir. His reasoning? That it was taking away from their relationship. But it was clear, Harold wanted to isolate her completely. It was like watching a boa constrictor slowly squeeze the life out of his prey. The parallels between Lynn and Toni were impossible to ignore. 2 Christian women, both kind-hearted and deeply committed to their marriage, both falling into Harold's web of dominance, both ultimately paying the price for their trust. Family members would later recount how stone-faced Toni had become. No smile, no spark, no life in her eyes after the move to Colorado. Toni's mother, Yvonne, would sit down with lead investigator Beth Schott, holding on to a secret she had carried with her, something Toni had confided in her. During Memorial Weekend of 2011, Toni and Harold owned a remote cabin buried deep in the woods. One night, long after their daughter Haley had fallen asleep, Harold got the sudden urge to clean up. He asked Toni to go downstairs and straighten up some broken glass from a shattered light fixture. As Toni bent over to pick up the shards, she was struck by a blinding sharp pain in her neck and collapsed immediately to the ground. Later's EMT will record Toni's version of the story. She was cleaning up when Harold accidentally threw a piece of wood over the banister, hitting her directly in the neck. On the surface, it looked like a freak accident, but now the investigators believed it was no accident. This was the first attempt on Toni's life. The injuries were severe. A fractured vertebrae, damage to her cervical spine, and numbness radiating down her left arm. A devastating blow for someone whose career as a surgeon depended on precision and control. It was nothing short of a miracle that Toni survived that night. What made it even more chilling was the mystery around the weapon. Some witnesses said the wood was a 2x6 beam. Others claimed it was a 20-foot long beam. The truth was clouded in darkness. But one thing was certain. Harold had tested the fates once, and fate had given him a second chance. As investigators continued to compile evidence against Harold, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. They discovered that Harold would leave town a couple Thursdays a month, always without a clear explanation. The team wondered, were these secret trips connected somehow to Toni's death? But Harold made a fatal mistake. A move so reckless, it all but sealed his fate. In a national park, Harold had placed himself square under the federal jurisdiction, and the long arm of the federal law enforcement. It doesn't miss. Lead investigator Beth Schott personally escorted the federal prosecutor to the crime scene at Deer Mountain. They hiked the far distance up the trail, but strangely they veered off of the mountain path. The prosecutor paused, confused. "This doesn't make any sense," she said. Beth Schott replied grimly, "Exactly. That's what you need to see." But the real shock would come when they would reach the picnic site, a deep, dangerous embankment leading down to the ledge where Toni had fallen, or more accurately, had been pushed. It was impossible to ignore the truth staring back at them. This wasn't a simple tragic hiking accident. This was cold-blooded, premeditated murder. Determined to uncover more, the investigating team placed a tail on Harold, monitoring his every move after Toni's death. But that was only the beginning. Armed with a search warrant, they entered Toni and Harold's home, looking for his phone, his computer, and documents locked away in his office. It's April 2013, 6 months after Toni's tragic death, and investigators are finally raiding the home of Harold, once shared with Toni. To call the scene overwhelming would be an understatement. Harold, it turns out, was a hoarder, not just of junk, but of paperwork. For over 20 years he had kept every scrap of paper, every receipt, every record, and now all of it was evidence. One box in particular stood out. Inside, decades worth of tax returns. What those records reveal were staggering. Harold had been unemployed for most of his adult life. The only fully verifiable job Harold ever held after college was at Chevron in Colorado. But even then, a former coworker said Harold was constantly on the verge of being fired, unable to complete a project, slipping through the cracks, until he abruptly quit before being terminated. The only other notable employment, a brief stint working at a fundraiser at a Christian college, where once again Harold resigned just before being pushed out, and the tax returns laid bare a chilling truth. Since 1992, Harold Henthorn had reported zero income. 2 decades of lies, manipulation, and intention, all buried under piles of paper, were finally beginning to come to the surface. Lead investigator Beth Schott was working tirelessly alongside an FBI agent to build a case strong enough to finally convict Harold. Her FBI partner was reassigned, leaving Beth to start fresh with a new agent, Johnny Grousing. Johnny's first question hit hard. Can we prove if the push was on purpose or by accident? Beth had to admit no. Johnny pressed on. Harold might be a liar, but could they convince a jury that he was a murderer? To answer that, Johnny needed to see the place for himself. They took him up Deer Mountain. Quietly and methodically, Johnny surveyed the crime scene, retracing the harrowing steps that ended Toni's life. On the long, intense drive back, he remained stoic, silent, giving no hints of what he thought. Beth and the prosecutor feared the worst, that Johnny didn't see it the way they did, until finally Johnny broke the silence. "That man killed his wife. He shoved her off that mountain," he would say. Relief and vindication washed over the team. They weren't crazy, they knew what happened. And now, so did he. Meanwhile, Harold carried on his twisted version of normal life. He continued living for 2 more years in the house that he'd bought with Toni, raising their daughter Haley under a growing shadow of control. Friends of Toni's would later say that after Haley was born, Toni seemed to fade into the background, a third wheel in her own marriage. Harold had always sought out a woman who was faithful, submissive, and easy to dominate. Now with a daughter that he could mold completely, it seemed Harold no longer had a use for his wife. Multiple factors had led to Toni's death, but the chilling truth was becoming clear. As the investigators pressed forward, Beth's team desperately tried to gather anything they could about Harold's past. His own family stonewalled them, refusing to talk, so they turned to former school friends, piecing together a dark portrait. One junior high classmate remembered Harold as charming, yes, but also annoying, someone you tolerate but didn't fully trust. More telling was Harold's behavior after school. He rarely wanted to go home, spending long hours lingering at friends' homes. The investigators quickly formed a theory. Harold's home wasn't safe. Digging deeper, they uncovered the truth. Harold's father was an alcoholic, prone to violence, a man who beat Harold's mother in front of him. One friend would recall a pact Harold had made, vowing he would never drink or raise his hand against a woman. A chilling irony, given what Harold had grown up to do. Sure, he might not throw fists. Instead, he dropped a car onto a woman's back, dropped a log onto a woman's neck, and accidentally pushed a woman off a mountain. No bruises needed, just cold, calculated death. It appeared that Harold was at his core a textbook narcissist, a pathological liar who spun countless versions of Lynn's death. And 2 years passed after Toni's murder, and Harold was still a free man, free to live his life, free to see his daughter Haley. The investigating team didn't want to rush an arrest. They needed the case airtight, no cracks, no escape. The fear that Harold, if backed into a corner, might harm his own daughter. After all, if he could do this to 2 wives, what was his limits? Toni's family, deeply suspicious of Harold, had to smile through and grit their teeth. Playing the long game, they visited, played nice, and went on trips with Harold, then turned around and fed everything they saw straight to the team, like undercover agents in their own tragedy. Harold, arrogant as always, started bragging, telling friends that law enforcement couldn't touch him. He thought he outsmarted the system, but after a year of this circus, Toni's family had enough. They went public, and in true Harold fashion, he retaliated. He cut off all contact, birthday gifts from the family straight into the trash, all to make Haley feel abandoned. Classic manipulation. Meanwhile, the investigators were patient, watching, waiting. They kept their eye on him for weeks, waiting for a moment where Haley wasn't with him, and when it came, they moved in. Harold was arrested on Toni's parents' wedding anniversary. Talk about poetic justice. He was taken to the marshal's office for questioning. On the ride there, the basics were asked: name, date of birth, occupation. Harold refused to answer, but once inside, sitting across from a young, attractive female marshal, he changed his tune. Same questions. This time Harold claimed, "I run a fundraiser, helping hospitals and churches." He knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't care if the arresting officers believed him. He only cared about charming the person in front of him. Classic psychopathic behavior. Harold was formally charged with first-degree murder. The prosecutor pushed for no bond, arguing he was a flight risk. They weren't wrong. Financial records show Harold had started moving money, possibly prepping to flee with Haley. The court agreed. No bail was set. While Harold sat in jail waiting for trial, custody was handed over to Lee Hettick, a long-time family friend. Lee would later say Haley didn't develop the way most kids her age do. Harold's control stunted her. She wasn't allowed to grow or make her own choices. During this time, the Rischels and Baudelaire family started comparing notes, and the pattern was chilling, with both wives dead near wedding anniversaries. Both in remote areas, both under Harold's watch, with no witnesses. No warning signs, according to him. But there was a silver lining in this darkness. Grace, Lynn Henthorn's sister-in-law, began speaking with her ex-husband Kevin. Some trauma pulls people apart, and others bring them back together. This case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence. There was no footage of a Jeep falling on Lynn's back. What they had was a puzzle, and no picture to go by. Every piece had to be found, examined, and connected, and calling it daunting didn't even begin to cover it. The investigators had a mountain of documents, statements, records, and they had to comb through it all, looking for everything that pointed to Harold. At one point, the question came up, do we offer him a plea deal? That's how unsure things were. Meanwhile, Harold brought in an experienced attorney, Craig Truman, a courtroom veteran, and Harold was going to need every bit of his experience. Now let's talk about the motive. Toni came from money. Her family was well off, old money, oil and gas and royalties, investments. She was financially set for life. Harold knew that, and honestly, she was worth more alive than dead. So why kill her? A close family friend visited Colorado not long before Toni died. She noticed something. Toni looked exhausted, like she had enough, like she was ready to come home to Mississippi and leave everything behind, including Harold. That same friend said Harold had fixated on money. It didn't matter what the conversation started with, somehow it always steered toward finances. It was like an obsession. The prosecutor had analysts go through the household finances, and what they found was damning. Every dime coming into the house was Toni's. But the person controlling the money was Harold. He was the primary account holder, signing off on everything. He had total control. Toni had been receiving royalty checks from her father's oil business. But those checks weren't going into her account. They were being deposited into Harold's. Her father caught wind of this and asked her, "Why are you letting Harold put your money in his account?" Shortly after, Toni opened her own bank account. She started depositing her royalty checks herself. Around this time, she also got a second phone and began giving a new number to her friends and family. That right there was her quiet exit plan. She was getting ready to leave, but she had no idea it wouldn't just end her marriage, it would end her life. The motive was becoming clearer. Harold had been living off of Toni's money. Now the money was drying up, and Toni was slipping away. And Harold, he wasn't ready to walk away empty-handed. So what does a manipulator like Harold do? He decided to cash in one last time, one final payout, the life insurance policy. The investigators still puzzled by something. Where was Harold disappearing those Thursdays and Fridays? He was hiring a nanny to take care of Haley, but where was he traveling to? No plane tickets, no hotel stays outside of Colorado. He said he was going out of town for business, but phone records told a different story. The cell towers placed Harold just 10 miles away from his home in South Littleton, Colorado. 10 miles, that's it. So why hire a nanny for overnight if you're right down the road? The investigators traced his movement to Southwest Plaza, an open-air shopping mall. They walked into a Panera Bread with a picture of Harold and showed it to the manager. The response, "Oh yeah, I know him. He's here all the time. He sits in the back with his laptop, on his phone for hours." But that wasn't the only place Harold frequented. He also kept going back to Estes Park, more specifically Deer Mountain. Call data showed Harold took 8 to 9 trips up there before Toni's death, and every time his phone mysteriously went dark, offline for 6 to 8 hours, before turning back on as he headed back into town. Now I'll say outright, this part is speculation. Well, when you put all of this together, it looks like Harold was scouting, mapping out a route, testing the terrain, finding the perfect spot. So let's recap. Toni opens a new bank account. She starts receiving her royalty checks. Harold starts making secretive trips to Deer Mountain. On his final trip before Toni's death, Harold calls Toni's office and tells them to block off a set of days. Says he wants to surprise her with an anniversary vacation. 11 days after that, Harold shows up to the bank. with a clearly forged signature and drains the account. The timeline, the finances, the secrecy, the behavior. It was all lining up, and it all painted a crystal clear picture of murder. Pretrial would begin in May of 2015. From the start, the prosecutors knew the strategy. They had to show the eerie similarities between the deaths of Lynn Henthorn and Toni Henthorn. Their goal? Prove Harold didn't just have motive, but the capacity and pattern to plan and execute these killings. The similarities were impossible to ignore. In both cases, Harold was front and center during the incident, and yet somehow walked away without a scratch. In both cases, his wife died violently. In both cases, Harold walked away with a significant financial benefit. But there was a problem. Harold wasn't on trial for Lynn's death. He was only being charged with Toni's murder. So the court had to decide, could Lynn's death be introduced as evidence? Both legal teams argued their side. For the prosecutor, Lynn's death was the key context, a window into Harold's behavior. For the defense, it was irrelevant. Harold's attorney fought hard to keep it out, but the judge called both sides to the bench. He warned the prosecutor, if you include Lynn's death in this case and it falls apart, we will have to start the whole thing over. Are you sure you want to go down this road? With complete confidence, the prosecutor said, yes, I want to include it. And the judge agreed. The similarities were just too close. The crashed car in Lynn's case, and the fall and the neck injury in Toni's. He ruled Lynn's case admissible. The trial would go on to attract media frenzy. Cameras were outside the courtroom daily. Crowds gathered. Reporters filed in. And when Harold was led into the courtroom on the first day, in shackles, Toni's brother said he looked like he's aged 10 years. The prosecutors knew they had to hit him hard from the start. They opened with something unforgettable, the autopsy photos of Toni, because Harold never once mentioned the massive head wound she suffered. Her scalp was nearly torn from her skull, and he hadn't said a word. The goal was simple: grip the jury, show the inconsistencies, and start to unravel Harold's lies. And it worked. But this wasn't just justice for Toni. The team felt like they owed something to Lynn too. Her death had been written off so quickly, swept under the rug, closed in less than a week. And her family was learning new, painful details right there in the courtroom. They had no idea strangers were the one that pulled Lynn's body from under the Jeep, or that Harold had been furious that anyone dared to help his dying wife. In classic narcissist fashion, Harold seemed to think the trial was about him. He smiled at friends, soaked up the attention like it was a game, but the prosecutors weren't playing. Lead investigator Beth Schott took the stand. She laid it all out, the full timeline, backed by evidence and cell phone data. She explained how the camera timestamp created a near-perfect record of their hike, from the moment they left the Stanley Hotel to the exact point where Toni was pushed. She told the jury how hard it was to get to the location, because she climbed it herself multiple times. Park rangers backed her up. This wasn't a casual stroll. It was a difficult, dangerous hike, and Harold and Toni, both middle-aged at the time. Beth later said she could see it in the jury's face, that aha moment. They finally realized this wasn't something random, some tragic accident. It had been planned. Harold's defense brought no witness, and Harold himself never took the stand. In closing, his attorney doubled down on the narrative. Lynn's death was an accident. It was ruled that way. Case closed. Harold wasn't a killer, he was a victim, a grieving husband who lost 2 wives. And here's the thing about criminal trials. The defense only needs to confuse one person to cause a mistrial. The prosecutor has to convince all 12. The tension was overwhelming. The families held their breath, hearts pounding, years of pain riding on one verdict. And finally, on September 18th, 2015, 3 years after Toni's death, the jury returned with their decision. Harold Henthorn was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Relief swept through the courtroom. Toni's family and Lynn's family both finally had justice they were waiting so long for. They always believed this day would come, they just didn't know how. Harold would try to appeal, but every attempt failed. The door had closed on Harold for good. As for Haley, Toni and Harold's daughter, She is the bright light of this story. She was adopted by Toni's brother and sister-in-law, and today she's thriving, a beautiful young woman, full of potential and surrounded by love. To the families of Lynn and Toni, we wish you nothing but peace and healing. The justice system finally caught up, and your loved ones will never be forgotten. If you made it this far, thank you, seriously. I'm a one-man band over here, putting in hours to bring lesser-known cases to the light. It means the world to me that you support what I do. So if you're enjoying this content, like, comment, and subscribe. This is not an AI channel. This is real storytelling. Until next time, watch your back.